Got it. All right. Well, I will get on with it. The clock has struck midday for at least everyone on the daylight saving time. My name is Josh Kirkman, and I'm the CEO of Surfers for Climate. I'm coming to you from Yamaji country in Western Australia. It's a beautiful place that's characterised by wildflowers and even wilder waves. This, like all the countries of this continent, sovereignty was never ceded to my colonial ancestors. This land was stolen. Yamaji people took care of the land and sea here for countless thousands of years. I would like to pay my respects to the Yamaji elders and community for their continuing custodianship of this beautiful country. I don't know where everyone else is coming in from today, but please feel free to comment in the chat which country you're joining us from. That's always nice to see. This webinar today is the result of a lot of hard work from a number of people who I am very grateful for. We're stoked to have you all here with us and take part in this special event with Professor Lesley Hughes. And this event is presented to you in partnership with Monster Children. Professor Lesley Hughes is a distinguished professor of biology and the Pro Vice Chancellor at Macquarie University. Her research is mainly focused on the impacts of climate change on species and ecosystems. She's the former Federal Climate Commissioner and former lead author in the IPCC's 4th and 5th assessment report. She is a founding councillor with the Climate Council of Australia, a director for WWF, and a member of the Wentworth Group of Concerned Scientists. And amongst all that, she's found the time to be with us here today. Surfers for Climate is stoked, once again, we use that word a lot in the organisation, to have someone of her calibre present today. We're working hard to create a sea roots movement of climate action within the surfing community, and is this type of deep knowledge that Professor Hughes provides that helps us understand what's at stake and how we do something about it. Before passing over to Professor Hughes, I will say that we will encourage questions through the chat, and just remember to keep yourselves on mute. And I'd now like to introduce our partner on this webinar, Jam Hassan, the executive producer at Monster Children Films, and he's going to say a few words before handing over to Professor Hughes. Over to you, Jam.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, just a quick one, I guess, from the partnering up with Surfers for Climate, and it's been a great experience being able to put on this platform. And from Monster Children's perspective and the way that we almost look at the opportunity from not only within the surf community, but I guess the greater environmentalism movement, is to really, I guess, understand the power of storytelling to be able to change the narrative, for the future, to be able to not only help, the masses understand the information, and there's so much information, I guess, to be able to process for everyone. And, I guess, you can see over time that the power of activism and the power of advertising and communication plays such an important role. For us, it's about really being able to distill that and create, storytelling that moves and creates, almost a connection that isn't just about the fight. And I think that that's a really important one to understand moving forward, is that, the recognition of, the different ways that people connect with information and with the environment can be, I guess, shifted in that sense. So, it's something that all of us can be, more conscious of, not only within the mediums that we access that information, but also that we all have that same power to be able to, mobilize our own networks and our own friends. So, it's something to be conscious of, going forward, but, we all operate in this world that we are publishers in that same right. So the ability to be able to tell those strong stories, to be able to help other people understand the information at hand. And, it's never been, I guess, a more exciting time than now to be able to tell these environmental stories. So, us as a community, and also a community of surfers, to be able to share that movement is a really interesting time. So, we're excited. And I think that, moving forward, and especially into, this election period where, the environment is going to be such an important pillar of conversation going forward, awareness and understanding of how that's going to play is going to make some really interesting moves over the coming months. So, it's enough about, from our side of things, and we'd really be really interested and open to hear from Dr. Hughes on what she's going to share with us today. So Lesley Hughes, we're really excited and humbled for your time. So over to you.
Thanks very much, Jam. Thank you to Josh and Surfers for Climate Action and Monster Children for inviting me along to talk to you today. I'm coming to you from Wallumattagal clan land from the Darug Nation in Sydney. So I'm just going to share my screen, and if it doesn't work, I'm relying on my colleagues there to yell at me, but I'm assuming that you can see a big picture of a bushfire. All right, so this is what I want to talk to you today about. I want to begin by talking about the IPCC report that was released a couple of months ago and why it's so important, and pull out the key messages for that report, because it's those messages that have to underpin our action. Then I'll talk about what we actually need to do, because those key messages, I'm warning you in advance, will be pretty confronting. So the report was released in August, and the tagline of the report is that climate change is widespread, rapid, and intensifying. And the head of the UN, Antonio Guterres, described it like this: code red for humanity. It's a great description. Just a little bit about the report to give you a flavour of how much work goes into these things. There were over 200 lead authors, 78,000 odd comments, 14,000 papers reviewed and synthesised, and more than 1 million words. Nobody is expected to read the whole report. I've read quite a bit of it so that you don't have to. So I want to sort of boil the report down, boil those 1 million words down to about 8 key findings. The first one of which is that it's now unequivocal that it's human activities that are warming the atmosphere, ocean and land and causing rapid change. There is no longer, and there in fact hasn't been a scientific debate about the attribution of climate change to human activities for decades. The science is very, very clear. And the scale and the pace of the change that human activities are wreaking on the physical and biological elements of the planet have almost no precedent in the whole 4.5 billion years of Earth's history. So we've now got nearly 50% more CO2 in the atmosphere than at any time since the pre-industrial period. And this is thought to be the highest level for at least 2 million years, probably longer. And the rate at which CO2 has increased in the atmosphere just over the last 20 years is about 100 times the maximum rate as we came out of the last ice age. Another report, a very important report that's been a bit overshadowed by the IPCC report, was one from NASA last June, which indicated that the amount of heat now trapped near the Earth's surface has doubled since 2005, and that is as a result of all those extra greenhouse gases. The Earth is warming faster than any scientist expected from a couple of decades ago, and the Earth globally now on average is about 1.2 degrees above the temperature of the pre-industrial period. Now I'm going to show you a little graphic now. It shows all the countries in the world arrayed in alphabetical order. You can see Australia about halfway along that top row. It'll start in 1900 and it will run through to 2018, showing you the difference in the average of the whole period in terms of temperature and what happened in that particular year, with the blue circles, the cooler years, the red and orange circles, the warmer years. After it gets to 2018, it will then project temperatures under a mid-range emission scenario from there till the end of the century. It'll take a few seconds to warm up, if you'll excuse that very bad pun, but you'll get the picture pretty quickly. So off we go. So that's all the actual measured data. And now there's the projected temperatures from 2018 per decade out to the end of this century. And the main message, of course, is that it doesn't really matter where you are in the world, things are going to get even hotter. So this is a graph from the IPCC report. I promise I'm not going to show you very many graphs, but it shows, going back a couple of thousand years, that the Earth was actually cooling down over much of that period. But come the Industrial Revolution, come us starting to burn lots of fossil fuels, put these greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, then the warming has been accelerating ever since. Now, all of you surfers, of course, are obviously very interested in what's happening in the oceans. The oceans, in fact, are doing those of us that live on land an enormous favour at the moment, because the oceans are absorbing more than 90% of the excess heat trapped in the Earth system. But that means we can now detect warming down to about 2 kilometres depth. The oceans are doing something else important as well. They're absorbing quite a lot of that extra CO2, but unfortunately that is changing the composition of the seawater, causing it to become more acid. And oceans on average now are 30% more acid than in pre-industrial times. Another important thing to say about the oceans that I'll come back to a bit later on is that because the oceans are absorbing so much of that extra heat, the climate system is not in equilibrium. Normally you would expect heat to pass between the ocean and the land and the atmosphere until it's kind of evened out. But at the moment, there's a net flow of heat into the oceans. Eventually, a lot of that heat will come out of the oceans and be redistributed around the Earth system. So that means a lot of that heat will actually make us hotter eventually on land as well. Now, I know that surfers are very, very interested in waves, so I did try to find out anything in the IPCC report about waves, and I'm afraid there wasn't much because they're not very well predicted using our current state of climate models. The only thing I could find out is that there's about a 5 to 10% change under a high emission scenario by 2100, but they could be larger or smaller waves depending on the region. So my apologies for not having anything more specific to say really about waves. Coming back to the key findings now, the third one, of course, is that the impacts of climate change are accelerating. Here's some of those. Glaciers all over the world are retreating. Some of them have disappeared altogether. This will continue. These two pictures were photos taken just 4 years apart. Our water cycle is intensifying. That is, dry areas are getting drier and more drought-ridden. Wet areas are getting wetter. And then when it does rain, because the atmosphere, when it's warmer, holds more water, rain and of course more energy now, when it does rain, rain is tending to come down in more intense bursts, and that is when we get major flooding. Here in Australia, the northwest, which is that greeny part of the map, this is a map going back to the 70s. The northwest has been getting wetter. The southwest and basically the eastern half of the continent has been drying since the 70s. Cyclone intensity is increasing. We're not getting more cyclones, but the ones that we do get are getting more intense and causing more impacts. And there's now significant talk about the need for Category 6. Extreme heat and heat waves are, of course, increasing, not surprisingly. 2020 was globally the hottest year on record, with the previous 7 years being the hottest 7 on record. Here in Australia, however, 2019 was our hottest year, and Australia has now warmed 1.44 degrees above the 1910 level, which is when we started to measure temperature. In 2019, for example, we had 3 times the number of extremely hot days as any year in the last century. And in January 2020, poor old Penrith was the hottest place on Earth. The frequency of these extreme events is increasing, and the significance of this for people is that extreme heat and heat waves have killed more Australians than all other weather-related events in Australia combined. So more than bushfires and floods and storms, add all of that up together, and more people have been killed by extreme heat. Looking ahead, we could get 5 times the number of days over 35, for example, in Western Sydney by the end of the century, and 50-degree days in capital cities like Melbourne and Sydney could become relatively common by mid-century. Back to the acceleration of impacts noted in the IPCC report. Ice is melting in both the Arctic and the Antarctic at an increased rate. In fact, 4 times the rate in the last decade as in the 90s. We are losing billions of tons of ice every year. Now, with all that extra fresh water going into the oceans and the fact that the oceans are warmer and therefore less dense and take up more space, sea level rise has also been accelerating, with the rate about doubling in the period from 2006 to 2018 compared to the average over the previous 4 decades. And here on land, bushfire seasons are lengthening and becoming more severe in parts of Australia. Bushfire seasons now regularly are 2 months longer than they used to be a decade or so ago. It's not just in Australia. This is a graphic from the 3rd of August showing the fires that were burning in that week. And you can see they were burning all over the world. With 2019 being Australia's warmest year and being also Australia's driest year on record, with rainfall 40% below average, it's not really surprising that the conditions for dangerous forest fires were perfect in that year. This map here shows the forest fire danger index going back to the 1970s in terms of how it's changed. And all of those brown areas are the parts of Australia where the forest fire danger index, which is used by emergency services on any particular day to assess fire risk, has been going up substantially. So in 2019, put the driest and hottest year together, and we got the so-called Black Summer bushfires. Black Summer, of course, is a misnomer because the bushfires actually started in July, in late winter, and then they burnt right through till January 2020. 18 million hectares at least of Australia were burnt, and that's an area about 3 times the size of Tasmania. The impacts were enormous. 3,000 homes lost, 3 billion animals killed or displaced. There were 34 people who died directly in the fires. 400 people died as a result of exacerbation of existing illnesses in hospital. More than 4,000 more hospital admissions than you would normally expect. And at least 1/3 of the whole population of Australia affected by smoke. It's now the costliest climate-related disaster in Australian history, with costs, and these are only the quantifiable costs, approaching $100 billion. So you can see that these bushfires indicate that climate change is certainly an environmental problem, but it's not just an environmental problem, and we actually need to stop talking about it purely in environmental terms, because it's a health problem and a social problem and an economic problem as well. Back to the IPCC, and this is a worrying one. worsening impacts of climate change are basically baked into the system already for at least the next 2 decades. Even if we were to stop emitting carbon dioxide and other gases today, we will still see the climate change because it takes a long while for the ocean liner to turn round. The climate that we are getting today is as a result of the emissions over the last 2 or 3 decades. So this is the only other graph I think I'm going to show you. This means that a further 0.2 to 0.6 of a degree is already locked into the system based on the emissions already. This means that we will go over, very likely over that 1.5 degree target sometime in the early 2030s, if not before. So what we have to work very hard to do is to, after that overshoot occurs, bring temperatures back and avoid getting up to 2 degrees. Key finding. The projected changes in these extremes are larger in both frequency and intensity with every additional increment of global warming. Every increment of warming is doing us harm. Here's a table from the IPCC report. You don't have to worry about all the details. I'm going to point out the important things. The IPCC used, sorry, I'll just have some water. The IPCC used 5 emission scenarios, so 5 different types of stories for our future, from low to high. In the long term, they're saying that in about a mid-range scenario, that's what our national pledges under the Paris Climate Agreement, that I'll talk about in a moment, will get us to 2.7 degrees. Our current policies don't actually live up to those pledges. Our current policies get us to a much higher rate of emissions, about 3.6 degrees. Under the highest rate of emissions that were modelled, we could see very significant positive feedbacks to the Earth system, getting up to more than 4 degrees by the end of this century. And I'll talk a bit more about these positive feedbacks in a moment. But one of the things that really has come out of the IPCC report now is the role of methane. We hear a lot about CO2 emissions. We don't hear so much about methane, but methane is becoming a much bigger problem. This definitely is the last graph, I think. In fact, methane, warming caused by methane is now about 2/3 of the problem of the warming caused by CO2. And the reason that it's such a problem is that molecule for molecule, methane is a much more effective greenhouse gas measured over short periods of time than CO2. Measured over 20 years, in fact, methane is about 80 times worse than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. Now, methane emissions have been growing really rapidly over the last decade. They're now higher than at any time in the past 800,000 years. And they've increased more than 150% since the Industrial Revolution. The main sources of methane are agriculture, particularly livestock, so cows and sheep burn methane all the time, but also fossil fuels, including fugitive emissions that are emitted to the atmosphere when gas is extracted. So coming back to these positive feedbacks now. Positive feedbacks mean that catastrophic events that are sometimes called tipping points in the Earth system simply cannot be ruled out. Here's some examples of those tipping points, some of which are well underway already. So if I go around these pictures in a clockwise direction from the top side, the Amazon is now turning from being a net sink for carbon dioxide to being a net source. That is, there is more carbon coming out of the Amazon now than the Amazon is sequestering in its vegetation and soils. This, of course, has been exacerbated not just by drying, but by the conversion of Amazon via fire into agricultural land. Next top picture, the melting of the permafrost is underway. And when the permafrost melts, all those frozen greenhouse gases like methane and CO2 released into the atmosphere and make climate change worse. Then there's the melting of glaciers and sea ice. When sea ice melts, there is more heat absorbed into the surface of the ocean because the ocean is a darker colour than the ice. That also creates a positive feedback. And of course, biologically, one of the tipping points that we are already seeing is bleaching of coral reefs. So the Great Barrier Reef, for example, has bleached 3 times in the last 6 years, with about 50% of the loss of coral. If we get to 2 degrees, it's been projected that over 90% of coral reefs in the world will be gone. Here's the last key finding, and this is the silver lining. It's that while the window for action on climate change is closing rapidly, it has not yet closed. So the climate future is still, at least to an extent, in our hands. So that brings me to what we have to do. So you will all know about the Paris Climate Agreement, aiming to keep temperatures below 2 degrees and trying really hard to keep temperatures below 1.5. As I've said, keeping temperatures below 1.5 is pretty well already gone. And I'll explain a bit more about that in a moment. The latest UN synthesis report, which looks at what the global governments are doing, actually indicates that while most countries around the world have some sort of emissions reduction target, they're not living up to those targets. And on the present trajectory, we will have 16% more emissions in the atmosphere by 2030 compared to 2010, giving us that 2.7 degrees by the end of the century. Now, I want to explain to you about the carbon budget, because the carbon budget is the way in which we can tell how much more emissions we can afford to put into the atmosphere to keep to a certain level of global warming. There is a linear relationship between greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere and the temperature of the planet. I'll skip over that because I promised no more graphs. The calculations that I'm about to show you in their simplest form are available in much more detail in this report from the Climate Council published in March called Aim High, Go Fast. So if you want a bit more detail, by all means, go and look at that report. We can use the carbon budget calculation to ask this question: will we meet the 1.5 degree target in the Paris Climate Agreement? Well, at current emission rates, we know now that at this rate, the carbon budget for that target will be fully spent. We'll have emitted all of it about 2.5 years from now. We would need a 5-fold increase in Paris pledges and their 100% implementation to stay below 1.5. This is why 1.5 will be exceeded, almost certainly. We can ask the same question about the well below 2 degrees target. Using the same assumptions, at the present rate of emissions, the carbon budget for 2 degrees will be fully spent in about 9.5 years, so by about 2030. To meet this target, we'll need about a 3-fold increase in Paris pledges and to meet those emissions targets. Globally, what this means is that to stay well below 2 degrees, emissions have to halve by 2030 globally. We have to be at net zero by 2040 at the very latest. And what this means is that all of those pledges that we're hearing so much about at the moment of net zero by 2050 is actually a decade too late. What this also means, of course, is that any expansion of fossil fuel development is completely incompatible with the Paris targets, and it doesn't matter whether that's coal or oil or gas, we cannot afford to do it. Now, as you're probably aware, Australia has been identified as an absolute global laggard internationally in a number of different reports. One of them is the UN Sustainable Development Report that came out a few months ago that scored Australia last out of 193 countries on climate policy and action. And then the latest report from the Climate Council, which just came out yesterday, on which I'm an author, we ranked Australia on two sorts of rankings, one for climate policy and emissions reduction and one on fossil fuel dependence. For the first ranking, we rated Australia last out of 31 developed countries. And for the second one, we rated Australia equal last with Canada, that is for fossil fuel dependence. So we are absolutely an international pariah on climate change, and we still will be, even if the government does go to Glasgow with a net zero target. Our Aim High Go Fast report from the Climate Council calculated what Australia actually needs to do our fair share of emissions reduction. And we calculated that our current emissions target needs to triple to 75% below 2005 levels by 2030. We need to get to net zero by 2035. And as I said, no new coal, oil or gas, and retire a lot of those ones that we've already got. Of course, what the federal government is doing thus far is not budging on one of the weakest 2030 targets in the world. We still don't have a national net zero target in any year, though it is very likely that Scott Morrison will announce a 2050 target. The government is still actively subsidising fossil fuels to the tune of $10.3 billion of our taxpayer money just last year, and is still spruiking a gas-led recovery. So now we look ahead to the COP26 meeting in Glasgow, where all the signatories to the Paris Agreement are expected to increase their level of ambition. Thus far, we have no change to the 2030 target. Fortunately for the world, a lot of our major trading partners and allies have indicated increased ambition. So 55, these are the 2030 targets for a number of countries in the EU. So EU, 55% emissions reduction by 2030, the US 50%, the UK a whopping 68%, Canada 40 to 45%, and Japan 46%. The good news from the IPCC, and there's precious little of it in that report, frankly, is that it explicitly states that the benefits of stronger action, that is action this decade, will be realised within our lifetime. So within the next 20 to 30 years, if we rapidly and deeply reduce emissions this decade, we could see a levelling off of temperature by about 2050 and moving into a safer space for climate in the second half of this century. So what do we need to do? Well, there are multiple scales of action. Climate change is a huge, wicked and complex problem, and there's no silver bullet. We have to act at the individual level, the community level, business, subnational, national and international. For example, governments everywhere need to remove fossil fuel subsidies. They need to electrify everything, transforming the grid, transforming transport, and no increased fossil fuel exploration or infrastructure. At an individual level, and somebody will always ask me about this, there's all sorts of things we can do as well. Obviously, moving to a greater proportion of plants rather than red meat in our diets will reduce that methane problem. We can move our money out of companies like banks or insurance or superannuation that are investing in fossil fuels and move that money to places that are not. We can all do things at home. If we can put up solar panels with batteries. And if we can't do that, we can all pay for green power. I think most of all, instead of just thinking about ourselves as individuals, we need to collectively join together in groups, and you're all here as part of groups because collective action will always be more effective than individual action. And just buy less stuff. Everything we buy, everything we consume has a carbon cost. We can get away with a lot less stuff. Community organisations then sit in a really important place, collectivising individual action and pressuring governments. And that's where I see the multiple ways in which community organisations like Surfers for Climate connect. But I want to also say something about the difference between thinking and acting. And this is how I'll illustrate it. Imagine this is a house. It's not actually my house, though I do consider myself a greenie tree hugger. Imagine this is a house of a greenie tree hugger with a certain number of solar panels on the roof. It looks like about 3 kilowatts. Imagine this is the house of a right-wing climate change denier that listens to Sky News and et cetera, and they put solar panels on their house as well to get cheaper electricity. The impact on the atmosphere of these two actions by these two different people is exactly the same. The atmosphere is not affected by what we think, it's affected by what we do. And I really think we need to keep reminding ourselves of that. It's action, not thought. And that's what that says. One of the things you as individuals and you as a community can do, of course, is talk to people. And I would point you to some conversation guides on the Climate Council website that have been designed for different circumstances and different groups of people about how to have those climate conversations, which can sometimes be hard. So my last few little messages now. We are in a climate emergency. It is a slogan, but it's true, it's a fact. Our physical and our biological world is transforming before our very eyes, and it's doing it faster and faster than we ever considered possible. We don't have a lot of time. Basically, it's what we do this decade by 2030 that will ensure or not a safer climate for our children and our grandchildren. Every fraction of a degree of warming matters because every fraction of a degree of warming is doing us and everything else on the planet harm. Every year matters. Delay is the new denial. And of course, every choice matters. Climate change has come about because of billions and billions of poor choices, some in ignorance, some due to greed. We have to turn that around and start making billions and billions of positive choices. And that's our choice there. We can choose to live in a world that is richly biodiverse, healthy and clean, or we can keep going the way we have been going and suffer the consequences. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Professor Hughes. I think, from my perspective personally, and I think I echo it, across everyone in attendance, to be able to understand, the clarity in that is a massive eye opener for all of us. And I know, I saw some of the comments coming through, and it is a scary future. There is a lot that needs to be done, and I think someone mentioned about climate change anxiety, and I think in this world as well, we've been hammered by COVID. There's climate change. There's a lot that we as a community, but also individuals, are trying to process at the same time. But I guess, starting from a personal level, what do you feel like are the most important things, someone can do to start off with? Because obviously you need to be able to move through from a personal level before community and those kind of things, just from a sense of being able to feel like we're on a momentum and doing those right things first. How do you think you'd kind of give advice to someone who might be in that same sort of mindset?
Yeah. Look, the single thing that is the most important thing to do is to vote for the climate. So we do have elections coming up. We have a federal election possibly this year, certainly next year. If even half the people in Australia contacted their local member and said, I'm only going to vote for you if you have the best climate policy of all the people standing in my seat, we would get real action really quickly. I think the next federal election is going to be very interesting because there are a lot of progressive independents that are going to be standing on a climate platform, hoping to emulate the success of, say, Zali Steggall in Warringah, who unseated Tony Abbott, and Cathy McGowan and Helen Haynes in Indi. There's a lot of voices for or voices of groups now putting up independents that have multiple policies that they're standing on, but climate is their number one. So they say we get the politicians we deserve. I don't like to think about that given our current crop, but that's the most important thing you can do, and talk to other people, your family and friends, about what voting for a particular candidate actually means for our future. That would be my number one.
Amazing. We'll go to a few of the Q&A questions that we have. One of the questions that came up a couple of times around acidity in the ocean. What does it mean to have 30% more acid in the ocean, and I guess the real world impacts from an ocean perspective?
Yes, well, I mean, the problem for the oceans is that many, many marine organisms have either shells or skeletons that are made essentially of calcium carbonate. And calcium carbonate actually dissolves if the water gets too acid. So it is the case that it's not 30% everywhere, that's the average. So cooler water absorbs more CO2 than warmer water. So that means it's higher, the oceans are higher in acidity at the poles than it is at the equator, which is a good thing because coral reefs are mostly near the equator. But looking ahead to the sort of pH we might get of seawater by the end of this century, it will be at a level that will simply dissolve the shells or coral skeletons of lots of species. So it's already affecting the rate at which corals calcify and the rate at which marine organisms can build their shells. There will be, speaking with my ecological hat on, that will mean that there'll be a strong selective force on organisms that are more resilient to that. So we'd expect to see genetic change. But it does unfortunately mean impacts and disruptions to marine food systems.
Another question was around your perspective on population growth and how, I guess, understanding the changes that we need as individuals, communities, and countries, but what population means to I guess the future from a climate perspective as well.
Yeah. Look, by mid-century, the UN projects, pandemics notwithstanding, about a bit over 9 billion people, and we're at 7.5 billion or so now. So there will be more people, and we'll need to feed those people. But if you look at a graph where you put the population size against, well, rather emissions against wealth, it's pretty linear. So countries that might be quite populous but tend to be poor produce far less emissions than countries with fewer people, but people that have more wealth. So, in a lot of ways, it's not how many people there are that counts, it's how they live. So our challenge, therefore, is to bring people out of poverty, to ensure from a social justice and equity perspective that everybody in the world has enough to eat and enough education and all of those things that we in Australia take for granted, without those developing countries making the same mistakes in terms of fossil fuel production that the developed world has made. So yes, population is important, but we're not going to control population. I mean, look at China tried to do that and it wasn't very successful. What we have to do is focus on how we live rather than how many of us there are, because how we live is something we can change.
I guess going back to, and I think this is something that, to be great for, Surfers for Climate to almost, put back from an individual level of, what we can be doing. And you mentioned plant-based diets, consuming less, move money, solar batteries, and, be able to join groups and collectives. But I guess going back to plant-based diets for a second, understanding moving from meat and livestock, but what that means in terms of farming. And the second part of that question is what impact on our food supply in Australia with repeated days over 50 degrees will happen, I guess, from trying to look at more of a plant-based diet as well.
Yeah, no, they're really good questions. So if I go to the impacts one first, certainly the impacts of extreme weather are felt on the front line by farmers, which is why, I get so angry. I get angry with the National Party for a lot of reasons, of course, but, the idea that they're actually representing their farming constituents by, not pushing for climate action is just absurd, because it is farmers that are on the front line. So, for example, at the peak of the last drought, we came very close to having to import wheat, which is normally our biggest, one of our biggest exports. So farmers are on the front line, but that also means that there's huge opportunities for farmers in terms of doing their bit by sequestering more carbon, either in native vegetation or regenerative farming that sequesters more carbon in the soil. A lot of farmers also are now increasing their incomes by putting up wind turbines and solar panels on their farms, and those renewable energy projects are entirely compatible with, say, grazing, for example. So there's huge opportunities in regional Australia by farmers, but at the moment, farmers in many parts of Australia are struggling, especially during drought. Now, in terms of the future of food, and the plant-based diet idea, one of the things that I find most interesting about developing technologies is the growth of research going into plant-based protein, and in fact, animal-based protein that's produced but not in an animal. So we can now produce, say, synthetic milk by using genetically modified yeast. We can produce plant-based meat, or stuff that tastes and looks and smells like meat. And these sorts of industries are growing enormously. So the growth of vegetarianism and veganism is growing, but also there is the technology growing that will eventually, if it all works, mean that we need a lot less grazing and cropping land to produce the food that we need, because we'll actually be able to produce that type of protein in a vat in a city. Maybe one day we'll all be producing milk in a stainless steel container on our kitchen bench. That's the way it's going. So personally, I find that side of the technological change really exciting, because then, of course, we can turn all those farms back into native vegetation. That is not to say that that won't be extremely disruptive for regional and rural communities as we know them today. There will be enormous transition, just as there is in, for example, coal mining communities.
A couple of questions on, I guess, from an energy perspective, and a great question from Andrew Martin. And I'll read out, I guess, the setup and the question as well. One of the greatest pushbacks I've encountered against changing to solar and wind is the waste created by them. There seems to be an argument against changing from coal for some people, like the inability to recycle and wind turbines or waste from solar panels. Have there been much progress in creating cleaner versions or recycling the byproducts from green energy options?
I'm far from being an expert on this topic, but I do know that there's tremendous interest now in what's called the circular economy, the no waste economy. So there's a lot of research going into the sort of recycling that Andrew is talking about there. So while I'm absolutely not an expert, I'm confident that there's a lot of research going into ensuring that, you know, when a solar panel or a wind turbine does come to the end of its life, the materials are broken down and reused. So, you know, I think expect to hear a lot more in future about creating a circular economy like that.
And a question about, we've got a question on a gas-led recovery. So we've been told that a gas-led recovery is what the country needs after COVID, with fugitive emissions adding so much to the atmosphere. Is gas fairly treated as a necessary transition fuel?
We absolutely don't need gas as a transition fuel. The dirtiest gas-fired power stations are actually dirtier than the cleanest coal-fired power stations. We just have to treat gas like a fossil fuel, not a better fuel. There's huge emissions from methane. As I said, the reason that methane emissions from Australia are going up is largely due to fugitive emissions from gas. And the only way that gas is actually economical now, new gas, is if the government subsidises the company. So, for example, some of you may have heard of the Beetaloo Basin, which is a big gas basin up in the Northern Territory. The government's poured more than $100 million into companies to subsidise them exploring and developing that gas basin. Without those subsidies, nobody could afford to do it. So it's basically taxpayers' money, yours and mine, going into companies to subsidise them to make our climate worse.
And continuing the energy questions, another one from Brent. Scott Morrison is, kind of pushing this hydrogen idea now, and hydrogen power. Is that a reality before 2030?
Look, I think it will be. Once again, I'm not an energy expert. I think that the key issue with hydrogen is that you have to be very wary of this government talking about clean hydrogen, because what they mean by that is anything but clean. It's actually producing hydrogen using fossil fuels and then trying to use carbon capture and storage to reduce the amount of emissions. Carbon capture and storage basically doesn't work. There's been billions and billions and billions of dollars spent globally. It's never really worked to scale. Yet the government keeps talking about it. What we do need is what's called green hydrogen, which is using renewables as the energy source. And then, yes, I think there's, and that's what Twiggy Forrest has been talking about lately, is green hydrogen, and there's now billions of dollars going into that. So when it will come online and be commercial, I don't know. I would suspect with the amount of money and interest in it, it will be well before 2030, and let's hope that's the case.
And I guess wrapping up questions and a bit from our side, there is so much to take in and so much that we need to, I guess, understand from what we need to do as individuals. But you mentioned it before, we are at one of the most opportune times in history as Australians, in a very positive time to be able to change the tide on the environment and a government and the issue that is at hand. We're coming up to this point where, I think connectivity is such an important one, and we have such strong communities that, like Surfers for Climate and things that we already connect with, that the more power, the more that we, rally around each other is going to be able to help to change that tide. And they're the big decisions that are going to allow that disillusionment or the anxiety from an individual to make more sense, and especially from our perspective, there's a positivity in that. And, I'm excited. I know that a lot of people that I'm around are excited that we know that there is that power that we do have. And I think that especially the momentum behind, young people to be able to drive that narrative and story is great. So, it is a lot to take in, but, I just want to say from us, it's like, the power is in us, and it is a great thing. So, we really appreciate the time that you've been able to go through this, but, it is one thing to be able to leave people with of like, let's, look at those next few months, and with the elections coming up, and know that as an individual and collectively, this is our time to, to create that sense of pride to be Australian again. A lot of people, feel it's like, I feel bad for being an Australian, feel that pride, step up and make your voice heard, because, it's up to us to be able to do that. So, less of a question and more of a, kind of a call to arms, but, yeah, I think it is a very, very positive time.
Look, Jam, one thing I always think about is if climate change was happening because of something the sun was doing, or a meteor or something like that, we would have no hope. But the one good thing about human-induced climate change is that we know what's causing it. We understand the science pretty well now. And if we've caused it, we know what we've got to do to fix it. And that is the silver lining. We've just got to do it fast. Could I just address one of the questions, or there's a couple of questions that have just come up around superannuation and banks and stuff. If you go to the Market Forces website, Market Forces is a fantastic organisation that keeps an eye on financial institutions as to their investments in fossil fuels, and you can very readily find out what your companies are doing and find out ones that you can make better choices about. So I just wanted to pop that in because there's a few people asking questions about that in the chat.
Josh, did you want to wrap up for us?
Can do. Tough act to follow. That was incredible. Thank you so much, Jam, for hosting that and partnering with us on this. I know that on behalf of Surfers for Climate, we were really stoked to have a team like Monster Children jump on board, and we really love what you're doing with your platform to raise awareness about this issue. And yeah, so we can't thank you enough, and thank you personally for being involved. Thank you, Professor Hughes, for taking the time out to check in with us. It was deeply disturbing, but also inspirational, and I think that's okay. I want to give a really big shout out to Heidi Lee Douglas for the tech support. Heidi is part of a really great team at Australian Parents for Climate Action. And so if you're up for checking out another great organisation that's doing amazing work in this space, please go and check out Australian Parents for Climate Action. They're a real cool bunch. Just to wrap things up, I saw everyone tapping like aggressively into their keyboards when all these different things were coming up. Market Forces this, and what can I do next? So it's really cool to see so much engagement from people. When it comes down to that question about like, what do I do to be involved in this? My advice to people is always just to look in the mirror and be honest with yourself about what you already do and how you can translate that into a climate action or contribute to a community or grassroots level campaign that leverages your best skills, because everybody's already doing amazing things in their lives, and we all bring experience and abilities with us. So much of the time what we've got is already in us. The tools we need are there with us. We've just got to apply it on the issue. So feel good knowing that you're pretty awesome already, and that the cause needs you, and that you're just fine the way you are. For Surfers for Climate, we spoke about voting. We have some pretty exciting things coming up in the next few months. One of which is calling on all of you to not be a kook this election. That is a campaign we'll be launching coming up in the next couple of months. We're doing the finishing touches on that, but please, we'd love to have as many of you as possible. I'm assuming you're not kooks already, so I'm sure you're going to be up for it, but please don't be a kook this election and vote for climate. We'll be ramming that down your throats and hoping you can help us get that out to the masses as well. In a week's time, we will be going live on our Sustainable Supply Club, which is our own initiative to deal with surfing's dirty little secret, which is petrochemicals in our supply chains and, our hardware that we all use. So one of the challenging things as surfers and wave riders is that the craft we use, it is a petrochemical craft, and that's okay too. it's served us well. We've had a lot of good time on it. It helps us stay physically fit and active, and our mental health loves us for it. So surfing's great, but our industry does need to clean itself up. And we're taking an initiative called the Sustainable Supply Club to try and build a movement within surfing to see change in that direction. And we'll be really stoked if as many of you as possible want to join us on that journey too. Look, you've taken the first steps. I'll wrap things up by just saying the most, the deepest gratitude for you all for turning up. It just takes that first step to get things started. So huge thanks again to everyone involved for showing up. Huge thanks to the tech support. Huge thanks to Jam as the host and partner on this, and Professor Lesley Hughes for all of your great work. So with that, we'll send a couple of follow-up emails to you all to say g'day and see how you want to stick around later with us. And we hope you do, because you're all a bunch of legends.